Welcome to the final I4Energy seminar of the semester. And for those who are in the room here at UC Berkeley, as well as those on other campuses, UC Merced, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Davis, as well as those that are watching it in their office or home on the webcast, we're delighted that you're here. And I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker today, Banny Banerjee, Associate Professor at Stanford University. I met Banny a few years ago and was just really very impressed by the team that he's put together down there, that multidisciplinary team. He is the founder of the Design for Change Lab to address issues of sustainability, technology futures, and the dynamics of rapid change. He's working with faculty from behavioral sciences, social economics, systems analysis, management science, engineering, and art to generate new platforms for design thinking. He's originally trained as an architect, but he holds graduate degrees in architecture, mechanical engineering, and design. In India, he worked in the fields of architecture, structural engineering, Adobe housing for the rural poor, and low-embodied energy building systems. Boy, I'm going to kind of skim through this because I want to get you going here. So he's worked for Xerox PARC and IDEO, and so please join me in welcoming Banny Banerjee.
Thank you very much, and thanks for making it on what I think is Dead Week. So I'm really nice to meet all of you. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you consider yourselves in the technology field? Show of hands. Fair number. Anyone in big data? Any in EECS? EECS? A few. Okay. Anyone in MEMS or nanostructures or, okay, one. Oh, there are a couple. Biomechanics, biosciences, okay. Any design folks? Oh, quite a few. Okay. Actually, that was a bit of a trick question because if you're a Homo sapien, you're a designer, right? So all the hands should have gone up. A little bit about myself. I'm a little bit of a reluctant academic. I've moved around from industry and have come into academia rather recently. And I teach at Stanford and I teach design and innovation. We have a program there in design, but we also have this institute called the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, where design is being offered to as classes and experiences to students from irrespective of their majors, and it's been quite a notable thing and has been a tremendous experience for us. But something that I really came to academia to do is to look at extending innovation in completely new directions, in directions that I thought are necessary and salient given the larger issues of the world. So let's just speak about the larger issues of the world, because no matter which field we come in, those are the board games we play in this room and the global context. And I'd like to frame what I'm doing in terms of a global scorecard that we can give ourselves. So let's look at some of the targets that we need to hit by 2030 and our confidence levels at being able to meet them. And so these represent by no means is a comprehensive list of our challenges, but these are challenges that are not very distal and remote, but it's something that is very close and are beginning to change the context in which we live and work. And my contention is that no matter which field we are in, at least a part of our perception needs to take these into account. But some of these targets are pretty amazing. For example, if you look at the connections between them, we need a much larger supply of energy, but at the same time we need a huge reduction in effective carbon emissions in order to control climate change effects. And those two are not good bedfellows. It's very, very hard to get both. And this one we are really losing on. The natural rate of extinction of species is roughly 27 or 29 or something like that. And currently we are in the midst of a mass extinction And depending on which report you believe, it's somewhere to the tune of 300,000 to 1 million species being lost. So it's a very, very large number, and that is not something that we are going to be able to intervene in this kind of period of time. So if we just look at one of those issues, such as energy, and we look at the energy targets for the US, if we want to reduce energy intensity by 30%, and that equates to about 25.5 quads of reduction in fossil fuels in order to get the kind of carbon emission reduction, that is tantamount to a 60-fold increase in all of solar and wind combined of our current capacity. And that's equivalent to, that is actually not equivalent, 1 billion tons per year of cellulosic conversion just gives us 5 quads. So this kind of gives us a sense of the scale, the magnitude of the challenges that we are facing, and just how flat-footed we find ourselves. And I think this is the other insidious issue, which is that a lot of our problems, as you know, are exponential problems, but we know how to solve linear problems. Even when we have a very, very aggressive success, they tend to be linear in nature, which means that no matter what we do, with our current thinking and our current abilities, chances are that the problems are going to outstrip our abilities. So what to do about this, right? So I would say this is, I love this quote from Dr. Batalden, who's quite a luminary in the public health field, and his contention is that every system is perfectly designed for the kind of outcomes we get. So if we look at these outcomes, then and if we believe and we buy into this framing of what a system does, then it also means that our systems are deeply wanting at a very, very structural level. And that is the things that I worry about. So if we have the current system, given the global scorecard, we are headed towards a future that is definitely less than desirable. And even if it is not, our confidence that it's not is very low. And what would it take to essentially change that trajectory from the future we are headed towards another future, and what does that transformation really mean at a scale level, right? So I think that what we can, if we take this point of view, what falls out is that our traditional institution and decision-making systems need revisiting. Not all of them, but definitely some of them. But what it also means is that given the scale complexity and the urgency and the interrelated nature of the problems, our traditional means and our traditional resources need to be used with disproportionate effect if we are to have any effect on this. They're not, with the kind of efficacy we know how to do, we are not likely to move the needle very much. And that means that we need extremely powerful, innovative approaches. And so one definition of innovation is that it's a way in which to outperform normative modes in order to create very, very new types of outcomes, values, behaviors, and transport system behavior, and ultimately create new kinds of trajectories and impact. So that's one definition of innovation. And then the question is, so what does that constitute? What would it take for us in such diverse fields to bring this about? But ultimately, I would like to point out that our perception fields, our perceptual lenses are crafted such that we see what we are looking for. So if we look for scaled impact, we will see solutions that go to scale, or else we won't. How many of you have watched that terrific YouTube video of the basketball players, the team in white and team in black passing the basketball back and forth, and you ask a crowd of people to count how many times the white team passes the ball, and at the end of those few minutes you say, okay, how many? And there's a little bit of an argument about whether it was 35 or whether it was 32, and then you say, okay, how many of you saw the man in the gorilla suit moonwalking across the screen. Practically nil, right? So essentially what it tells us is the way we are geared, we see the problem, we see what we are looking for, and to some extent I would say that the global scorecard is a manifestation of the way we make decisions and how the directions that we drive our thinking towards. And so what would it take to, if we don't think about what would make the needle move, we are likely to make advances that are extremely impressive in our current frames, but might be completely irrelevant and inconsequential in terms of the scale of the challenges that we are facing. So I think what we are looking for, if we are talking about scaled impact, is a very, very deep transformation in the way our systems behave. And essentially then, if we are to attempt to make those very, very large scale transformations, that would be predicated on paradigms that are completely new, because we know where our current paradigms get us, and the judgment is open as to whether our current thinking is going to get us out of the hole we've dug ourselves into, or more likely dig a bigger hole. So we need new types of thinking, new paradigms, but we also need ways in which to have those take effect at scale in the kind of time periods that matter. Because time is not, once one looks at these large-scale issues, time is not on our side. So if one talks about the larger systems and the way we operate as a set of cascading failures, one can argue that we have the mother of all failures is the crisis of direction. If you don't aim towards a certain kind of outcome, chances are that you are not even going to get there. And I'd argue that our entire way of defining success and defining our civilization is at profound loggerheads with what would keep that exact system alive, even if we look beyond in the 30 to 50 year time frame. And a 30 to 50 year time frame is of course a very small fraction of time, given how long it takes for institutions and systems to evolve. So one of the biggest issues is crisis of direction. So we need a technology and a way of thinking in order to arrive at the right directions. We have a crisis of means. We have to generate completely new technologies in order to solve technologies in a broader frame of the word, in order to have the means and use the existing means in very completely new ways. But then, of course, I think that the raison d'etre of the citrus is a pointer to this, which is that a lot of very interesting technology gets created, but then it doesn't get applied. There is an inefficiency in how much of that gets applied, and if one just takes a look at the large heaps of IP portfolios that the larger corporations have, it's somewhat it's a testimonial to how much thinking doesn't ever make it out. But then if it does, then does it make itself out with some level of efficacy, or is it provincial in its scale of impact? And then once you get that, does it scale to the scale of the larger systems? Does it scale to a global scale, a regional scale, a national scale, etc.? And does it start affecting the system behavior or not? And then does it do it at a speed with which it matters? Because right now, if you're facing exponential challenges, whether you meet it when the rate of change is low or whether the rate of change is high, when you meet it has a profound effect on the scale of the target that you're trying to hit. So if you do the same, if it takes you 20 years as opposed to 3 years, it might be too little too late, and you might as well have not done it or done something much simpler. And then, of course, the issue is that the challenges, that these grand challenges, don't neatly break down into the way our disciplines have broken down, and we have these neat walls between disciplines, and we like to stay within our disciplinary boundaries and ask questions at the very bottom of the base of the silo, which is, of course, very, very important, but we have not built the commensurate skill at the integrated level. So we don't have that horizontal depth, so to speak, that speaks to the integrated nature of our challenges. So what we tend to do is we get myopic about one outcome with an underlying belief system that unless you are focused, you're not going to achieve anything. But you tend to feed Peter and then Paul goes hungry. So we don't have a way in which to look at systems as larger integrated systems. So if these are all the ways in which at every stage there's an inefficiency, and it's like a large gear train where each one is stealing efficiency from your system, then we need thinking in order to fix things at every level and the interplay between them. And to some extent, that's what we are trying to attempt to do. And this is essentially the same thing at a slightly different level, different view of it. And right here is the intentionality or the implied intentionality under everything that we do. There's an underlying theory of success that is implied, whether or not we know what that is, we know how to articulate it, and that drives what is it that we choose to spend our time in, and what is the technology that we choose to promote. And then we say that, okay, we'll push that technology into the application end, we'll find some ways of scaling it. That'll give us new outcomes and completely new relationships between stakeholders, and bring new stakeholders and new ways of creating impact in the world. And then eventually we hope that the system will equilibrate in a very different with a very different behavior with much more desirable outcomes. Now, even in the way we go from our intentionality to the time it cascades to actual effect, we know that there are lots of losses that take place out there. But we also know that because we are stuck in our disciplinary systems, and though that defines our perceptual lens, we don't have particularly good mechanisms to have our vision of what we would like the system to be at the integrated level, to inform what our intentionality ought to be. So that the fact that there's a crisis of this feedback loop is one of the grandest issues about how we built our institutional and disciplinary systems. And while we need to maintain that part of the disciplinary system that really gives us the depth and not rock that boat, my contention is we need to also have a portfolio where we ask these questions and find ways of innovating across disciplines. But I think that the other issue is that these issues, once you take a look at it from a global perspective and the magnitude at a global level, are extremely confounding, and you tend to get paralyzed because none of our current means tend to transport over to that scale. So then the thinking tends to be of going back into what you can control and creating an efficacy within those boundary conditions. But then, of course, it doesn't translate to the global scale. And so the challenge is, how can we have things that take place out here and actually affect things that have a strategic value at the global scale or at the regional scale, at a larger scale, and do it with a time constant that is aligned with the time constant of the systems that are breaking down. The bedrock under our civilization is fracturing fast, and how do you speak to that? But also, how do you, if we are saying that ultimately a lot of these things, if they're not huge, big institutional plays, also is the summation of the behavior of people just going about their lives. I came from the South Bay in a car that only gives 23.5 miles a gallon, and tomorrow I'm flying to India, right? That's just how I behave, and you put a summation around that, meaning that implies that we need, another planet close by to really extrapolate this behavior, right? But I think that what we are looking at is that our decision-making systems are intricately tied and are informed by our underlying frames and theories and assumptions. And each of our fields have an ontological and an epistemological system that tend to get extremely crystallized and sometimes ossified and calcified, and it's very hard to poke into that because we create religions around our own disciplinary systems, and we tend to collaborate across disciplines. So this is a very familiar term where we come together and we bring our disciplinary expertise together, and just about anything, like even this, for example, is a highly integrated device, and is the result of at least 30 different disciplines working very closely together: radio antenna folks and chip designers and battery experts, etc., UI experts. And there's another model, and that is co-creation, where you do not define yourself in terms of the discipline, but you surround a challenge, and yes, you have a disciplinary background, but you realize that you're walking into a problem that has not been of a class of challenge that doesn't have an a priori model, and the model needs to be hacked because it's an unknown problem, and so you can't use known solutions towards a completely unknown class of challenges, and you need to hack a new system. And the difference between these two are that looked at it obliquely, in collaboration, people stick to their disciplinary boundaries. But in co-creation, what happens is that you create new epistemologies and new ways which are in terms of the class of the challenge, and it opens up new possibilities. So if you take a step back and think about how we innovate, this is actually the notion that one can create new epistemologies in terms of new classes of challenges that did not exist, or we did not aware of the existence of which in our birthplace of each of our dominant disciplines. Our dominant disciplines, when they were born, did not have the view of the class of challenges we have now. So we need completely new ways of doing it, and this is one very, very powerful way. And this notion is also gaining a lot of currency. But essentially what we are doing is this. We are essentially creating disciplinary parallax, right? And each of us with our discipline have a perceptual lens, but if we look at a much more complex system and we look at it from two different perceptual lenses, it gives us an ability to look beyond our own discipline and see something of value. And it's that discourse that goes on with saying that why am I seeing a rectangle when you're seeing a circle, that allows you to interpolate what lies beyond and the thinking that lies beyond. So this is something that we have been experimenting with in a very formal way and have a lot of war stories to tell you. But essentially what we are after is ecosystem level innovation, and it's very clear that our universities are platforms for a certain kind of thinking, and when that fails or that goes short of what the kind of thinking we want, we create institutions that allows for other kinds of thinking. So Citrus, for example, is a beautiful institution that promotes a kind of thinking and a kind of action that is very difficult to do within, for an assistant professor who has to get their tenure, right? And it promotes that. So you need new platforms. And you need a broader view of what a technology is. So anyone wants to take a crack at defining in as few words as possible what a technology is? What is a technology? Anyone? Just take a crack. We are all friends here. So I have a very, very simple and perhaps very simplistic view of what a technology is. And I'm going to say it's that which allows us to control or affect an outcome. It doesn't have to be a scientific technology. It doesn't have to be, we don't need to see it in those terms at all. Ultimately, it is an ability. And as the more we hone that ability and the more we make that flexible, and we create a set of tools such that we have a machine shop, and when we need to do turning, we use the lathe, and when we need to do milling, we use a milling machine, and we know how to use them together, it's a technology. The larger packet is a technology. And let's look at what we are doing. Back to the energy problem, right? Here is a population that is choosing to get on flights to India and driving in a Honda S2000 from Stanford to Berkeley. Here is the resource consumptions that are implied. And there are two things. There's the impact on the environment and the threat to the sustained and equitable quality of life, because we are dependent on the continued supply of those resources. So what do? We essentially have efficiency measures. So we have technologies such as smart grid, the LED lights, compact fluorescence, etc., higher efficiency engines, and so on. And then we have other. We try to offset from one kind of energy source to some other kind of energy source that is more benign, right? So biofuels, solar, etc., right? Wind. But there are other ways of affecting the same equation if we don't think that the population is a constant, right? The fact that the usage is, if we think, is a constant, then that's the way to look at it. But supposing we say that we can change behavior, right? Then you're actually attacking the same area of that rectangle from a different way, right? Now most people don't think behavior can be modified, so it doesn't get much traction. But I would place a pretty darn good bet that at least 95% of you have a cell phone with you, right? 10 years ago, I wouldn't be able to place that bet. That's how profoundly behavior changes, right? So if we look at a goal, which is not only to reduce it, but to say that the cheapest barrel of oil is the one you never use, then let's start looking at even behavior, right? This is just one example. But I would say in the larger workings of the different things, where we look at systems where there's technology, there's business systems, there's behavioral systems, economic systems, all interlaced, the gummiest of them that brings the entire system efficiency to its knees often is the behavioral aspect. Think of our institutional structures, think of our larger systems, think of our usage patterns, and see how much can be affected by behavior. Denmark has a higher quality of living compared to the US in quality of life studies. The per capita energy consumption is one half, right? It's pretty profound how much behavior can play a part. But the other really interesting aspect of this is that just like I implied, it allows you to approach something from not just the supply side of the equation, but the demand side of the equation. And then, of course, we know that if we have a tremendously powerful technology like the next internal combustion engine, how long will it take to deploy it over 200 million, a fleet of 200 million cars? And what is the payback period of the embodied energy to come to the day when you actually start winning that energy back? Compared to that, and behaviors can actually, if you do it right, can transmit much faster. Think of the number of people on Facebook, right? That grew much faster than the number of Priuses. So one of our initiatives is, I'm not a behavioral scientist, and the reason I'm pushing behavior is not just to push behavior, but to essentially push the concept that once you bring multiple fields together, you get new possibilities. So this is one of our experiments. We call it D delta B, which is designed for change in behavior. And essentially what we are combining is design thinking, which is my field, and with behavioral economics and diffusion theory. So essentially we are saying we will build in the theories of behavior into our technologies. And if something is to diffuse fast, we are not going to expect it to diffuse after the fact. We are going to build in diffusibility into the architecture of the design. We will understand what it takes to scale we will obsess about it and build the scalability into the system, because if you don't build it early in the game, then you're putting Band-Aid on Band-Aid and ruining about the fact that you should have done it a whole lot earlier, right? So essentially the way we are looking at it is that we have systems that tend to create a groove in a behavioral way, and humans as well. And we are saying, can you create a groove which is different, which will create its own gravitational field where it will pull people and the groove will become deeper, and that's more desirable to us for the outcomes we want. And what would it take to get the system and the people within it to go there, the decision-making systems, etc. And of course, how do you do such a task, right? What do you do? But before, meaning there are a lot of people, I bet, are skeptics in this room, but like they're very, very, profound tests that are very simple. This is the percentage of people who sign up for organ donation when they get their driving licenses, based on whether it's an opt-in or an opt-out. If you have to opt in, 42%. If you have to opt out, 82%. And it's neither, but you are forced to make a choice where at that point in time, unless you fill that form, yes or no, the process is not complete, then it's 79%. And that's that's a profound difference by a very, very simple thing. And that's because we are not particularly logical. We are predictably irrational, right? And that's across countries. And these are countries that have an opt-in system which says, if you want to donate your organs, please sign it. And these are saying that if you want to not donate your organs, sign this, right? Now, if this is such a small example with such profound effect, think of what we can do if we combine our traditional technologies with behavioral systems, right? The potential is amazing. So if we don't think of our systems as just economic systems, and we say, okay, the way they're playing out are this massive bowl of spaghetti of social systems, behavioral systems, technological systems, business systems, policy systems, regulatory systems, and natural systems. And they're interplaying in these really interesting ways, and a lot of the outcomes that we are getting is the emergent behavior of the systems. And we have these pitifully small means in order to change any of that. Then one way to think about it is to ask oneself, where would you place that needle if you were doing acupuncture? Where, if you looked at the system, where would you get the biggest bang for your buck? And that's thinking. It's a different kind of thinking in itself. And so what we've been trying to do is to take this, it sounds hubristic, but we are kind of hacking a new field. It is a field about how you transform systems from a very multidisciplinary way. So we are looking at it as a system, and we are creating a whole stack of an ontology, an epistemology, an action repertoire, a way for the system to grow, to create the metrics within it, the community around it, the impact properties, etc., etc. So we are trying to create that thing because we wish we didn't have to do it because it's really messy, but that's the nature of the challenge. It's not, the challenges are not going away, so we are taking a crack at this, and these folks are coming in with tremendous amounts of depth in what they do. They are the Federers and the Macy's of that game, right? So they're terrific at what they do, but then they come in and we try to make this larger game happen. So in order to do that, we realize we need new structures, just like Citrus, and so I've been working with a large community of people around the world, and I'd love to collaborate with folks in Berkeley as well. And it's a modest and yet extremely aspirational stab at this question, saying that what is the organization that would do it? What's the organizational structure? And we want to have those innovation methodologies be very deeply intertwined with the praxis. How do you practice this, right? How do you actually make this happen? So we are creating the theories, we are building the theories, but we are also embedding them in the right kind of projects, and we're trying to incubate and initiate new initiatives, large initiatives. But we also realize that it's also about scaling this kind of thinking. This is much larger than the small number of people who are rattling around trying to do it. So there's a notion of how do we build a larger community and get the counterpoints to this and build that larger thinking. And so essentially what we are doing is we are speaking to people in each of these sectors. Within academia, all the disciplinary members, we're speaking to the public sector, to the NGOs, philanthropy, communities like civic communities and digital communities, etc., the private sector and special experts, etc. And our dream, and this is a very large dream, is that just as the scientific revolution gave us departments of science and technology, the funding for science, an entire economy based on science, R&D departments in every organization that does science. What is the equivalent of that alongside that? That responds to the current questions, which is the need to be in control of and affect the future. So we hope that just as design thinking has become an artifact and it's a meme, we think that this obsessing about scaled transformation will pull a certain set of eccentric people into this game as well. Okay? So essentially we realize that we do not understand what the problem is, and the innovation has to be done on both fronts, innovating in the problem and innovating in the solution domain. And the attempts at working on the solution domain is actually going to inform us what the problem really is, and we'll gain fidelity as we go back and forth. But also it is about radically new theoretical approaches, but also radically new implementation approaches. And it's a really hard thing, because once you're in your own field, it's very, very hard to know what you're missing, because there's an inbuilt belief in what you stand for. So the stepping out of your own belief systems is about the hardest thing to do. And so we are trying to do this in different ways. This is just a poster from a project that we are doing for ARPA-E, which is of course a government agency that is looking at advanced energy research. And most of the energy research is going towards carbon sequestration and new forms of energy and biofuels and so on. But there is this project that has to do with looking at the intersection of technology and behavior, and can you change behavior systems? And suddenly, sensors and data clouds and large data and feedback systems, and one cleverly intermeshed with known ways of changing behavior, looks like a very, very interesting way of looking at the same problem that typically you think of only in terms of combustion and kilowatts. And a lot of some of the things that are going in very unexpected directions and are showing very interesting early results. And we are finding that, for example, this one is actually an app based on real-time data from that we are getting from residences, but are fed back in ways that are very, very different. And we are seeing that, okay, not everybody cares about energy and never will, but they care about something. And so we are mapping their energy behavior to something else that they care about. And in this case, it's the energy savings that are allowing them to make microfinance loans. Now that seems like a very small and silly experiment, but what the larger story behind it is that the boundary conditions of what we consider technology is widening, and we are thinking of this just as a software engineer who also does EE has a choice about whether to write it in firmware, whether to write it in software, and it's a choice. We are doing the same thing. Is we are bringing the behavioral element in it as well. This is another platform project that is really pushing us to do a lot of interesting thinking, which is the question is, how can we provide the security of 100 liters of water per family per day in very poor communities living in water-stressed conditions on the planet? Now, it's not just getting them the water, it's the confidence that they will have the water. Because once they have the confidence, all sorts of social capital breaks out, and women can go and work, and there's financial inclusion, and you manage your land differently, and food security changes, and it's a very, very integrated problem, and needs to be looked at in integrated ways. So we are essentially going off, and our target area for starters is India, because we believe India is a tremendous kind of petri dish of the future. You can do time travel if you had a time machine, or you can do time travel if you just go to a different place where the future is playing out. Very high population density, extreme stratification of economic and social strata, extreme denudation of natural resources, tremendous food shortage, tremendous water shortage, tremendous energy shortage in an extremely competitive economic landscape, right? It's a petri dish like no other petri dish. So we are working there because we think that this will yield new models and new theories, and we are looking simultaneously at the social aspects and the infrastructural aspects and food security. And the moment you look at it from this way, you come to very different conclusions, and you can make a very good counterpoint around the current meme of centralized systems, because you realize that the per capita distribution mile goes so astronomically high when you go into the very, very tertiary ends that the cost of distribution will never reach some of these people who are at the very, very end, as it is borne out by the fact that these people are still living in extremely suboptimal and inhuman conditions, even though the country has had tremendous GDP growth year after year, right? But we also, in order to figure out what it is that we are doing, we are constantly trying to package this in ways that can be taught. And that's an experiment. But it's also we feel that one of our responsibilities is to not just create the technology, but create the capacity among people to think in this way alongside whatever it is that they'll do. So we have classes where we try to take our current thinking of the process and embed them in very, very large-scale challenges. So I teach a class called Large-Scale Transformations and Sustainable Transformations. And the scale of the challenges are immense. We are working with the government of New Zealand to change the future of their fresh water. Or we are working with cities to redefine the cities in Japan that have been hit by tsunamis. Or we are looking at creating a new kind of utility for Chile. And so they're or a village loans and savings program for adolescent women that will use IT in completely new ways for employment generation in 6 different countries that Nike.org will roll out. So these are all real projects, and so we are testing our processes, but much more importantly, we are testing how do people think given that process. And what is emerging is that we think that leadership is not something that you get to after 20 years of doing well in an organization. It's a modality, and that modality can be assumed by someone of any age. And so we're exploring what that might be, and we have a point of view of what any individual agency is. But we, of course, very, very interested in those individuals who have very large spheres of influence, because we want to influence them as well. So essentially the game for us, for me and the people I work with, is essentially creating this negotiation between managing the future and creating the future. And collectively, with the help of absolutely brilliant people in different fields, in technology fields and policy design, etc., create a more integrated way of thinking. Thank you.
Questions for Banny?
There's one question in the middle there.
There's so many attempted engagements with communities in the developing world. I work with a class called Design for Sustainable Communities here on campus. And so many of them fail because of a failure to understand the behaviors and the cultural context and that sort of thing. And we very frequently find ourselves suggesting, oh, if only this, or if only that, or if only this. And then the conclusion is, well, that's not going to work there because that's not how people are living, and that's not what their priorities are. So I'm very curious about how you integrate that reality of being, culturally sensitive and understanding where you can make a difference with your advocacy here for really focusing on behavioral change.
Yeah. So actually, that's a brilliant question, because the gear train I showed you, where the behavior is often the failure mode, it's not just the behavior that's the failure mode. It is the lack of understanding of behavior by designers that is actually a bigger failure mode, right? So a lot of our processes have come from a history of being human-centered, and we've stolen tools from anthropologists and sociologists. So the first part of the project starts with, instead of coming up with ideas from where you are, of immersing yourself in the context and unpacking what's really happening, who the stakeholders are, what the relationships are, what the feedback loops are, how is resource flowing, how is information flowing, how are decisions being made, and what is the larger backdrop in which they sit. And that gives you a much better idea of where the leverage points are. But ultimately, once your beautiful idea goes out there, whether it will make that last mile, because the last mile is where a lot of elegant ideas essentially fail, and it's because of this. But I would say that part of the process is just having the humility of knowing that if you sit in cubicles and have these ideas, they are cubicle-shaped thoughts, and they're not likely to work out there. So the process needs to be extremely iterative. In fact, endlessly iterative. At any given stage, you're at beta, right? Then you know what to do next. You're never done. And the attempting of solving the problem with increasing levels of resource allocation is directly tied to feedback loops that is coming out of very, very active testing of current concepts, because it's a little bit like taking a big boulder to a top of a mountain, and you can let go of it on one face or the other, and it'll land up 300 miles from each other because it'll gain momentum. And at some level, early in the stages of design, you're at the top of the mountain and you could let go of it on this face or the other, and you need to be informed by the ground conditions in a very, very sensitive way. But what we found is that just going by human-centered thinking and going and doing ethnography work and so on is insufficient. It needs to be borne out with much more better theoretical aspects, with a lot of studies that have been done in more structured ways alongside. So you need the tactile information that comes out of the stories that you speak at the level of the field. But you also need to borrow from theory of agency systems and theory of self-efficacy and intrinsic motivation. And so because those people have tried it out across countries, and they have techniques that can be embedded just like any other technology. You use a 555 chip out there to do your timers. Here you use behavioral principles. Any other question? Way back there.
So I'm curious how your experience has been, like, pitching this kind of work to, like, let's say the New Zealand government, which typically, historically, they might have gone to a professor of water resources or a McKinsey and Company to kind of do that kind of work from a very analytical, narrow point of view. And you're telling a very broad story. How's that been?
I think that one of the things, we are early in this kind of work, and of course, by the definition of the fact that you're trying to do something counterculture also means that you're butting up against the current culture, right? But what we have found is that every system that we are working with is not a homogeneous monolith, right? If you're working with Exxon, you're working with the government of India, or any system, the city of San Jose, or any such thing. From the outside, it looks like a monolith, but it's actually very heterogeneous. And if you hold out a tuning fork that lets out a very peculiar frequency, some people step forward and the others run in the other direction screaming. But there are some people who step forward and there's already a built-in simpatico between what you're saying because they've already felt the need for it. And they actually already have their own theories of what would work that they've built alongside yours. So it's not just that, okay, we are going to help you. It's much more of an eager partnership saying, what do you know, what do we know, let's see what we can hack together. But those conversations are actually, I'm finding, absolutely amazing. And I'm having more of those than I physically have the time for. Because each of them is a mushroom that grows, and then I have the opportunity to speak to their teams, etc., etc. And what that is telling me is that just like a Doppler shift in the sound tells you that the train is coming in your direction, I think that this is not just me and my counterparts elsewhere in the world just shouting in the wind, but there is a genuine need that has already been felt, and there's a hole that there's a sense for, and we just need to create the methods to fill that larger hole.
We have one last question.
Any comments? Yes.
Is it possible to prove that these methods yield better outcomes? Is it possible to prove that these methods yield better outcomes, and what metrics would you use in order to make that statement?
Yeah, actually, excellent question, because that brings us brings up the question of how do you instrument this for performance measures, right? And typically, when you look at transformations in entire systems, even if you outperform the natural rate at which a system transforms, and let's say the system takes 100 years to coalesce into something, and that's the clock tick, and we are bearing the legacy of everything that's come, and crime in Oakland is tied to slavery, it's like cascading effects, right? It's still, you can still create a way in which to create the indicators of success early on. And essentially, I would say that it can go horribly wrong as well. This is by no means is this method better than any other. It's a set of tools, right? So every context in which you're working would actually, part of the job is to create the strategic approaches and do the sensing, do the synthesis, do the framing, do the concept generation, do the prototyping, do the testing, go back to the framing, etc., etc. But what you're doing is instead of saying, here's this grand plan, does it work or does it fail? And what kind of a grade did it get? Did it get an A grade or a C grade? What you're saying is we're going to grade ourselves in every step. We're going to have a metric at every step. We're going to create the instrumentation, create the metrics at this stage, evaluate, and then keep the proposition such that the the data that is coming back is allowed to move towards a more optimal way. So then what happens is that you're not taking this measure or that measure and saying this gets an A plus and that gets an F. You're saying, given this really messy situation, how can we get anything, even if it's a suboptimal team working on it, how can we get them from a B plus to an A, right? So essentially, that's a part of the process. As to whether this particular approach is better than any other approach, I think this is just one approach, right? This is alongside other approaches, and you can have. But I think that one needs to tie a very, very insightful classification and taxonomy, characterization, I would say, of the challenge, and ask oneself whether that's the tool you're using. If it's an optimization challenge, optimize. But if it's not an optimization challenge and you use optimize, you have the wrong metrics built in from day one and don't expect great results then, right? So.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.